Hey, it's Joe West from the West Barn with
Mike Shimshack.
Today we've got mastering engineer Pete Lyman. He's a Grammy Award winner, owner of Infrasonic Mastering, or Infrasonic Sound, with locations both in Nashville, Tennessee, and Los Angeles. A total of 6 mastering engineers work out of that facility. I'm assuming in the LA one. Are you the real quick here before I welcome you to the show? Are you the only one working in Nashville, Pete?
Actually, there's 2 in LA, and everybody else is here in Nashville.
Okay. In this location that we're seeing right now?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. We have 3 rooms here, and we share rooms. So this is my room. I share it with a mastering engineer named Piper Payne, who works with me, who used to be in Oakland, and Dan Bacciagalupi, who works for us, and he also assists me. And
what a great name!
Yeah, our manager Raylan Janicki also is a mastering engineer. So she kind of splits her time between mastering and managing and handling the day-to-day. And then she works out of Dan's room.
Awesome. Well, he's mastered Grammy Award winning and Grammy nominated albums for Chris Stapleton, Tanya Tucker, Jason Isbell, Brandy Carlisle, Sturgill Simpson, John Prine, Weezer, Panic at the Disco, and much, much more. He's got a Neumann AM32B 1956 cutting lathe in this facility here in Nashville. I believe we saw it on Reed Shippen's episode as he walked us down to meet you.
Cool.
So welcome to the show. We thank you for spending some time with us. It's always great because, you know, our guys are fairly into the deep dive technology wise, but they all want to know, everybody has this little seed of insecurity as a mixing engineer or a tracking engineer, that when their song goes to mastering, and there's a little bit of insecurity as to what it is that's going to really push it over the edge. Like, what level do we need to deliver? And is the vocal going to become more prominent in the mastering? Or, you know, all these little things that you have insight for our audience. And so we're grateful that you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So this spot that you're in, you know, I've been over to Reed's place a couple times. This is a house that Reed has over there in Nashville. And it's like, this room doesn't look like, if you're on the outside of that house and you're looking, like what I'm looking at right now, looks like it's impossible that could be inside the house, because it just looks like a regular 70s house, right?
Yeah, we're incognito back here. I mean, you drive through this neighborhood, you would never suspect that there's a large SSL room and multiple mastering rooms in this house, you know? And the room I'm in is, so from what I understand, there's 2 additions on this house. And obviously no one lives here. It's just a studio. You've seen Reed's room already, which was a large build out that he did years ago. And this room was some sort of addition that I think was probably built right before that. It was part of the structure when Reed bought the house. So kind of the story with me being here is I had a large facility that I built in Los Angeles in 2012 with my old partner, Jeff Ehrenberg. And we bought a building. We were partnering with a company called Vintage King. And we owned a building with Vintage King. And basically what we did was, it was about 6,000 square feet. Bottom floor was Vintage King. Top floor was Infrasonic Mastering. Did a massive multi-room build out there. And a couple years later, I told my partner, hey, I want to move to Nashville. I'm tired of LA. And threw a little bit of a monkey wrench in that, but it ended up being being the best move for me, and frankly, the best move for the business. My wife and I had just had our first child, and, you know, we're kind of older parents, and we were tired of the grind of living in LA. And it's fine. It's fine if you're single or if you're just a married couple with no kids. But I really wanted a different environment to raise my child in. And it just so happened that I started working on a lot of music from Nashville. So I do a lot of work with a producer named Dave Cobb, who's a really good buddy of mine. And we started working together, like, I don't know, 12 years ago back in LA. And I remember when he told me he was moving to Nashville, I was like, you're fucking crazy. Why are you moving to Nashville? You know, and it worked out, I guess. But so he kept, after the Stapleton record, he just kept bugging me. Between him and Vance Powell, they both really helped me get to Nashville and kind of get settled. And during that time, I had met Reed. it just seemed like we were going to somehow partner up and do something together. I moved out here with no studio. I'm partners with PMC Loudspeakers, and they were kind enough to basically let me use their office in Berry Hill, which is literally a mastering room, set up with pretty much the same monitoring system I use. And I worked out of there for a while. It was fantastic. And then Reed called me one day and said, "Hey, this space just opened up." And I asked him what the dimensions are, plugged them into the AMROC calculator. I'm like, that room's going to work. I'll take it. So I came in here, built it out, and it's gone through a few different versions, but I'm really satisfied with the way it's set up now. It's actually the best sounding room I've ever worked in, and I did most of the work myself with my assistant. GIK Acoustics designed the back wall for us. We installed it, and they helped with some placement and some room calculation. And the rest of it was done by me, my assistant, and our mastering engineer, Dave Gardner, who's in LA, who is an acoustician and has consulted and built plenty of studios. So we built it out, and I love it. Best room I've ever worked in. And just the room dimensions just work perfectly.
Right. I'm always surprised by that. I remember going up to Ted Jensen's room in New York before they had the place down in the meat packing district. And his mastering room was, I almost thought it was a dentist office, before they had gotten it, because the rooms were that size. Dentist offices are actually like a room is smaller than a regular room, in the old school ones. And I just remember thinking, like, little seeds along the way is like, what's super important? Get your room right. Know what's super important? Having great gear. Know what's super important? None of that. Just be great, because Ted was making these records that I was idolizing in this room, or other guys like Frank Filippetti, watching him work. And you're just like, what's really, really important is being awesome, finding out what is awesome about what you do and getting the gear that works for that.
And that's exactly it. It doesn't, I always use the argument. It's like, I'm not a race car driver. If you put me in a Formula One car, like, I'm sure Dale Earnhardt Jr. would kick my ass on the track in a Prius. Like, it's all about learning the gear and learning your room. And I think a good engineer is going to learn any room they're in. Every room has issues, I don't necessarily think having a ruler flat room means you're gonna do better work. you know. Having said that, this room is pretty flat. We in both of our rooms here we use the off systems.
What systems kind of broke up there?
We use a room correction system designed by a company called Trinov out of France. So it's a standalone Linux box that kind of does time alignment and allows you to sort of, feather little areas that might need a little bit of work. You can do a lot or nothing. So, our approach to tuning the rooms is getting the room as close as we can without that, and then using that to just sort of augment. And I've been using that system for 8 years.
Is the goal a flat room, or is the goal a room that has some pleasing bumps in it that are going to be out in the real world?
For me, the goal is not really a flat room. I listen differently than, for instance, I share this room with Piper Payne. And one of the great things about using this Trinov system is that we're able to have room presets. So when I come into work, I hit my preset. When she comes in, she hits her preset. Her preset has a little bit more low end than mine. Mine probably has like a dB more like up at the top than hers does. We just listen a little bit differently. I like it a little bit more sizzly and exciting.
Yeah.
But I think you just get, like you want an accurate room and an accurate monitors. And I use the PMC BB5 XPDs. They're unbelievable,
Could they put another consonant or vowel at the end of it? What are they?
Just PMC BB5 XPDs. It's
not to be confused with the XBMs, which are made for motorcycles.
The XPDs are basically just another. It's 415s and then mids and the tweeters.
So this is a great point of conversation. I can remember being younger mix engineer. Maybe I was trying to become a mix engineer. I was living in New York City and trying to really fill up my schedule with mixing. And I can remember sort of having the issue of like, okay, what monitors do I really want to focus on? Right. It's like, do you buy the Genelec 1031s, which were the speaker of the day back there in the mid 90s? And they just sound so pleasing. It's like everything that whenever you're a kid and you're driving in your Honda Civic and your 8 tracks in there, and then you have the little power amp underneath to give you an extra 150 watts with the EQ.
Graphic EQ.
Everything. It's like, I don't even know why they put knobs on it, because everyone looks like this is the EQ code, right?
Yeah.
So do you go for the speaker that is enjoyable, that you're like, this is fun today? Or do you go for the NS10, which is like, feels like you're working in a coal mine, because you're just being hit with 1K and you have to make a decision. It's like, what do I want to be listening to? And what are the consequences of having a very fun full spectrum thing versus the other?
Yeah. I mean, these speakers are pretty flat from, I can't remember. It's something crazy like 14 or 15 Hertz to like 30 plus, and obviously in a mastering environment, you need that. I don't want anything that's going to hype the track, because, then I might not be taking care of any issues that need to be addressed. Right. So when something sounds like shit, I need to know, that's a
good point.
That's really, really important. But, at the same time, when I'm driving around in my truck, I've got a fancy pickup with some crazy, gazillion speakers in it, and everything sounds awesome. And it's just fun to drive around in and listen and listen to the satellite radio or whatever and hear everything, blast out of it. But that's not what I would want to work on.
Right. It's impossible to know what you're listening to through all that processing. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
It's not my microscope, and this is my microscope.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I got a question. So it's like, we're talking about frequencies, and it's like you're saying from 16 Hertz to 30,000 Hertz, in the human ear, they say here's between 20 Hertz and 20,000, but you can feel below, like when a dump truck goes by and downshifts and you're in a building, you feel those frequencies. Those are infrasonic waves, the name of your studio. And then you feel things above, harmonics, you sense them more than you hear them, 20, maybe 30, at 30 and maybe 40,000 Hertz. Maybe you're able to feel those. But the reality is, the human ear, if it's hearing between 20 Hertz and 1K, the human ear hears really, really well between, let's say, 150 Hertz and 1K. That's like half of what you hear. Or like the lion's share, we'll say 3/4. And then from 1K all the way up to 20,000 Hertz, it doesn't hear that well. It's not really good at hearing those frequencies. You're a lot less sensitive. So if you were to look not at a flat room, let's say you make your room flat, but the realization is that the human ear doesn't hear low end as well as it hears 1K. So is there an argument to be said, like, well, if you make your room flat in 40 Hertz is the same level as 1K, if the human ear does not hear 40 Hertz as well as 1K on a meter, they're correct, but your ear actually hears the opposite of that looking EQ that you put into your 8-track player. So it explains why we do this with our EQs, right? Yeah. Because we don't hear those frequencies as well. You wonder, like, what is the goal in a listening environment?
Well, I think there's a difference between the mastering environment and, let's say, an audiophile room in someone's house.
We'll talk mix and mastering.
Yeah. The ultimate goal is translation on the largest number of systems possible. So if I'm doing a track that has a shitload of sub in it, I need it to translate on someone that has a big speaker with big system with subwoofers, and someone that has like an
iPhone
speaker or an iPhone, or AirPods or whatever. So, my argument is I need to be able to hear all that sub information. I need to be able to hear it accurately. And so for me, that's important. But, for a casual listener, I think, most hi-fi speakers that are out there today, they're not anywhere near flat, and we know most headphones aren't anywhere near flat. So
they accommodate for the listening experience. So maybe it makes our flat listening experience a little more valid.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Yeah.
if you make it sound like what you want it to sound like in your dope Jeep mix, right? If you want the final EQ version, once it goes into that EQ again, because everyone else is, then you've got a real problem.
That's the thing. Yeah.
It's chicken or the egg.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we don't really have control over, once it leaves here, I don't have control over how much treble someone adds on their stereo.
I gotta know, like, when you get let's say you get a song that's so based around the low end, it's like completely, the mixer has spent his whole day making this thing work, and the key ingredient is the low end. And then you get it and you realize that 80% of the world listens on iPhone. So you've got to figure out how that is going to be able to be played on an iPhone, right? So tell me what your approach would be to make a mix work that it's like, man, this is like not, the physics of this doesn't work.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've got something that crazy. I mean, my first goal is to try to make the producer and the artist happy. I want to help translate their vision and just fine tune it a little bit. My goal isn't to take what they send me and like, here's my thumbprint on it, I'm making it this completely different thing. But if I get a track that just has an excessive amount of low end and I know it's going to be unlistenable on certain devices, then that's time to break out the EQ and start wrangling in that low end a little bit. Mm-hmm. So, there's a ton of different tricks we use for that. I mean, mostly EQ, sometimes high pass filters. I'm more of a low cut person than just automatically applying high pass filters, because I think low cuts oftentimes sound better than just just a steeper high pass. Some of it might be compression. Rare occasions it might be multiband compression. But to tell you the truth, I use multiband compression probably 3 times a year, maybe, if at all. I'm not a huge fan unless there's a real big issue. But if you get a track that is just not going to be playable on some systems, then it's time to talk to the engineer and the artist about it.
Right.
That's very rare. And I would say with the mixers that I work with, it rarely happens. It's also rare that I ever kick back a track to anybody. So I usually assume if what a client sends me, that's what needs to be mastered. If there's a technical issue, then I'll address it. But I did have a track the other day from an artist who I've been working with for years, so I felt comfortable bringing this up. But I listened to the track, and you could tell there was a phase issue. You're like, I feel seasick all of a sudden, like everything's weird, and I'm like, the bass is panned all the way to the left, but there wasn't any other, it wasn't a stylistic choice. It wasn't like all the drums and bass were on the left and all the guitars and vocals were on the right. You're like, oh, they're doing like a Taxman thing. That's kind of cool or whatever. But it was like the fundamentals of the bass were on the left, but there was a shitload of sub information on the right. Mm-hmm. And so the low end phase was all squirrely. Like it would have been impossible to cut to vinyl.
I know this. I know what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
It happens in my system whenever I get like, let's say I freak out my system and my cache gets weird. If I were to print something at that point without listening, it will print a file like that. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, that's the funny thing, because I think that's what happened, because she went back to the producer and he's like, oh yeah, that's not right. So it was just an example. So, obviously when there's something blatantly wrong, that's when we go back and have a discussion, and but I find usually, and obviously that was with a client I've been working with for years. But in this job, like, communication's key. So when I'm establishing a relationship with a new client, it's all about trying to figure out what they want up front and what direction they want to go.
Producers and mixers appreciate that. I've had mastering engineers that have I've gotten mixes back or masters back from, and you could tell that they didn't honor what the intention of the mix was. It was a different mix after I got it back, and now it didn't work, because a mix is so fragile. So, all my favorite mastering guys, whenever they're done, they didn't change the intent of the guy that spent all day with all the individual files. So that's a commodity. I have a question for you. On the iPhone, tell me, Mike, if you know this too. It's like I hear whenever I have it vertical, turn it off so you don't see my text. When I have it vertical, it comes out of this speaker, which I assume is mono. But when you turn it sideways, sometimes mine, I don't know, just because it's old and shitty, it will do some bullshit attempt at throwing some high end out of the speaker for your ear, you know? Yeah. So it's like, I think it might be a stereo version here and then like mono here. Yeah. Do you got either of you guys know the deal on that?
I'm not familiar with that.
I'm super curious. I mean, because everybody, if you look at the data, everyone's listening to things, you know, I listen to so much stuff on this phone just because I'm not going to walk down to my studio and fire up my Mac and, you know, then sit there and download a file and listen to it. I'll listen to it on here. So
to be totally honest, like, I give zero fucks how something sounds coming out of this thing. I want, most of the time I want to just throw this in the trash all day. Like this, if you're mixing and like, I know you should be able to hear it on this device and it should sound okay. But I have to say, I don't believe in mixing or mastering for the lowest common denominator.
Okay. Interesting.
I want it to sound good on AirPods and I want it to sound good on headphones, but you know, it's never going to sound as good coming out of a dinky mono speaker built into an iPhone. And I think most people have a reasonable exception that it's not going to sound hi-fi coming out of a band-passed phone. Yeah. And so my opinion is like, I wouldn't want to compromise a track to make it sound better out of the phone.
I hear you.
And honestly, a well-mastered track is going to sound just fine.
That's what I was going to say. The fact that you haven't been getting complaints says a lot about you as a mastering engineer because the world's listening on phones.
Yeah, I just make sure it sounds as good as it can.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm not, you know, a lot of people ask like, oh, how many sets of speakers do you have? Like, I have one set of speakers. Do you do car checks? No, I don't do car checks. If a mastering engineer has to go do car checks, then they probably shouldn't be a mastering engineer. I mean, I can't trust my room. You know, I do have a little, I don't know if you can see it off to the side. I have this, and this is just mostly for fun. I have one of these little Bose SoundLink minis. It's like an old Bluetooth speaker. And honestly, and I have it routed to one of the outs of my console. Honestly, I just every once in a while flip back and forth to it's just a nice idiot check. It's kind of off axis to the side, not even aiming towards me. And that's just like, hey, we're all hanging out by the pool with your Bluetooth speaker. What does it sound like, you know?
Yeah.
And I throw it on every once in a while just as a sanity check. And sometimes I'll even use it when I'm printing. After I work on a record, if I'm going back and printing, obviously I pull the volume way down and it gives you kind of a different experience. And sometimes you'll even catch little, you know, you'll catch the little things that you're like, oh, I hear that now that I'm down at like 70, you know, like really.
Yeah. Really. You know, there's nothing wrong with multiple speakers, but over the years, my speaker setup has gone from just one set of speakers that I've been working on now for 22 years. I've been working on the same set of monitors. I
want to clarify about the speakers. If I was a mix engineer, I would definitely have more than one set of speakers. I'm speaking about mastering. My philosophy is you need to have a room you trust and speakers you trust. I think it's confusing at the mastering stage, not the mix stage. I see the value in being able to I need to clarify this before a bunch of people comment about, oh, blah, 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 blah. So I definitely see the value of, I mean, all the great mixing engineers I know have more than one set of speakers. So I'm talking mastering specific.
Well, you know, I've had the same set of original Mackeys, the 824s, that were the very first batch of them. I've had the same set since 1998. And I just found myself going less and less to the NS10s until I just left them turned off. And, you know, I know these speakers, and I don't love these speakers, by the way. I like to listen to them. They're fun. They're bright. They're big. So there's a pleasing listening environment. It's not like you're listening to, to NS10 all day, that mid-range killing you. So it's enjoyable. But after 22 years of mixing on these monitors, at a certain point, I got rid of my NS10s. I just didn't need them. And I do have a little dealio where I could stream it through my phone. And I've got a little, boomboxy type situation, just oddball. A lot of times I'll take a set of headphones while I'm doing vocal levels. I'll tilt the headphones out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sit them on the desk and mix low. And it's maybe the finest resolution vocal mixing you can do, They give you an easy break too between monitors.
Yeah. Have you used that Audio Movers plugin? That's pretty cool. I use that every once in a while for remote clients.
I hear it's awesome. I haven't used it, but I hear it's fantastic. Do you enjoy attended masterings, or do you like to be left alone?
Okay.
Let's get right into it.
Okay. I prefer unattended sessions. Yeah. There's a number of reasons why. Well, first of all, I love meeting people and I love hanging out with clients. I as far as attended sessions,
it's just a fake hang up.
Want to sequence, and
hold on, you broke up there. So you said something about.
If they want to come in, and for the sequencing portion, maybe, right, and to kind of listen down to a few things. It's distracting for me to have someone stand behind me while I'm working, honestly. Yeah. And I find that I have a certain methodology that is maybe not super, that doesn't always work well with constant feedback and interaction. So I might be listening, like when you're mixing, you've got a client, like you're honing in on the guitar sound and they're talking about the kick drum sound.
Right.
And you're just like, yeah, I know. I'm
getting there. Yeah.
Loud, but that's on purpose. I'm like, yeah, and I like to jump around a lot when I'm working on an album. So I do prefer unattended. But the biggest reason I prefer unattended is I've found over the years I have a very low recall rate. So I'd say we nail most things on the first, maybe one revision. Mm-hmm. I have found personally that I have far more revisions with attended sessions. Mm. And that's usually due to clients second guessing things in the room and not, every once in a while, maybe not letting me go with my instinct and asking me to do something. Then later on, almost always like, hey, can we go back to that thing you were talking about? It's not that the clients don't understand their music. It's that they don't understand this room. I sit in this room every day, and I've been in this room for, 3 years now, and I've been listening on these speakers for 10 years.
That's a great point. I do it. I'd rather mix unattended, and I don't mind if people come and they don't heckle me as much as I think they would, as much as I'm afraid they would. But the reality is, as a favor to them, it's like, I'm going to give you the gift of a fresh listen to your record on speakers that in environments that go listen in your car, listen on whatever Bluetooth speaker, on your headphones. Get a first listen to what I think about your record, because the mix is the biggest place where the record becomes, and it's like, I'm going to give you the gift of a fresh listen so you can have a known listening environment, and you can go back and forth between your Stone Temple Pilots record or your whatever record and the record we just did. And then we can have some conversations that are productive where you're saying, hey, this feels different than X, Y, and Z, rather than standing in front of your monitors that they don't know and saying, I hear a lot of low end because there's a 15-inch woofer in front of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And, there are times, this hasn't happened to me in a long time, but, where a client isn't necessarily familiar with your process and they're watching what you're doing. And sometimes you get someone that's just technical enough. They're like, oh, well, why are you boosting at 1.8? Or why are you adding high end there? It's like, well, I'm adding some high end there because I'm actually limiting the high end at the end of the chain, and I'm opening it up during quieter passages and trying to make sure the louder passage get too sizzly. But you're right. If they just listen to the track in their own environment, they didn't see how the sausage got made. They just enjoy it, you know?
That's 100% of the time. And, you know, it goes back to, we've talked about this. It's like the real gift that you learn as becoming more mature, as preparing for great outcomes. If you want a great outcome, sometimes the smartest thing you can do is not lean over the bass player's shoulder or talk to the drummer about your kick pattern that you want to make sure that they have in this section. Is like, hire that artist and let them do their art, and then course correct and or redo with someone else, because they're going to turn into a mathematician and they're going to lose all of their art.
I 100% believe that in all aspects of life. I mean,
in all stages, when they get to mastering as well. It's like, I went and mastered something with Ted Jensen, and he's like, aren't you going to tell me what to do after like the fourth time he listened through? And I said to him, I'm just happy to be out of my barn. You know, it's like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're Ted Jensen. If I don't like it, I'll go hire someone else. But it's like, I want you to do you. That's why you're on this project. Yeah.
And I think, you know, when you get to that stage in your career, it's really nice. And I think most of the people come to me because, you know, they trust me. And frankly, I don't really have to deal with a lot of clients that are going to put me in that position, because that's just not where I'm at. And I would frankly rather just not take those jobs on. I mean, there have been a few times, usually happens like every year and a half, 2 years, you get a request for a job, and you're just like, I'm sure you felt this, like working on a record. You're like, there's no way I should take this job. There's no way. This is like every, like, you know, horns and sirens are going off. It's like, just run. Don't take this client. It's not worth it. And then you do, and it's just, there's just no way you're going to make them happy. And you knew it all along. So in the middle of it, you're like, I knew I should have followed my gut. Yeah. You knew before. I mean, those are rare, but I also think it's, sometimes you got to know when to not take that job too. Mm-hmm. You don't have a magic prescription for that. That works 100% of the time. You just raise your rate to an amount that makes sense, that if it is grief, you're just like smiling ear to ear because you're making ungodly money. It was just like the most obscene amount of money. And you're just like, hey man, whatever, keep on with the revisions, you know? So commensurately raise your rate to get rid. I never say no. I raise rates. Yeah. Chris Athens told me the exact same thing one time. We had this conversation. He's just like, give them the FU price. Like, you don't want to do it. And then if you do it, it's then worth your time. And I think that's totally fair, because, you know, ultimately everyone's paying for our time. So, you know, there are some artists that part of their process, and then this is fine, is to go through and continue changing things. And you will occasionally run into an artist that can't finish a record. They just can't. It's rare, but it happens. Back when I played in bands, I was in bands with people that just, no matter what level of success, no matter how good the recording was, it was never done, because once it's done, it's over to them. So, you know, you'll run into that occasionally. It's rare, but you have to be on the lookout for it. And and it's important that you make sure you're not getting yourself into a bind, you know? We've been talking to the last couple episodes about, it came up through Andrew Sheps on the interview with him, with Rick Rubin. And we just talked to, I think, Jim Scott yesterday about it, but it was like, it's not done until it's great mentality, but it's crucial to know when it's done. Yeah. Because if you get a perfect steak and overcook it, it's ruined. So it's like, you've got to know it's not done till it's great, but know when it's great. Don't take all the magic out of it by trying every option on every knob, you know? Exactly. And artists will do that sometimes because it's so important to them, but they need to have enough trust in someone else that they can say, okay, I'm going to step back because I've lost perspective. Yeah. And I mean, most of my clients, and I think that's one thing that they appreciate about me, is I'm the I'm the last person in the chain, and I'm that perspective. I haven't spent 5 months listening to these mixes and in the studio agonizing over that one guitar overdub, or I'm not the bass player that made a tiny flub in a song that I hear every time but no one else is ever going to hear. To me, a lot of those imperfections the imperfections in records like that, to me, are what I love the most. Mm-hmm. I mean, I grew up as a punk rock kid, and none of the stuff I listened to was perfect. I love hearing all the weird little, bizarre vocal accidents where you hear a ghosting of a vocal in the back or a weird little guitar flub now and then. It just sounds kind of human to me, I feel like you can tell when a record's been overworked.
Oh yeah, you can. I've been guilty of it too. Hey, it's like, give people hammers, they're going to be looking for nails, right? So yeah. give them infinite grid movements and they're going to move everything infinitely on the grid.
Yeah. I mean, I've always argued, back whenever, years ago when everyone was still arguing about analog versus digital, my biggest argument was that, digital just gives you too many options. And I think for a long time, records often weren't as good because people had too many options. They edited, it just became normal. Like, let's automatically edit out all the dead space between each kick drum and all the space between, like,
the toms and
toms and stuff. And it's like, why?
Let's have the vocal pop on right before.
Yeah.
And you can hear like the or whatever before. It's like, that is part of, you need to audition toms in and toms out. Sometimes the toms in sound better, make the snare sound better.
Yeah.
Those good drum kit.
Exactly.
All drummer good room.
Add to the, exactly.
Speaking of analog versus digital, what are you using? Are you all in the box? Or are you?
I am nowhere near all in the box. Frankly, I wish I was. I don't feel comfortable all in the box, but I have a very hybrid system. I use a lot of analog gear, but I definitely do processing in the box on the way in and on the way out through my mastering chain. So, to give you kind of a brief overview of how my workflow is. So, if I'm working on an album, we get the album in, we assemble the album. I like to rough in spacing and everything before I even start on the record, because to me, when you're mastering a record, you're not just mastering individual songs, you're mastering this piece of art as a whole. So I think of a record more as a record rather than just individual pieces of music. So on the way out, I have a whole process. To me, mastering is like 90% gain staging. So I have a very specific way that I feed my console. And that involves adjusting levels on the way out in the DAW. I have a very specific structure that I send out through my converters into my analog chain, because I know how every piece of gear sounds operating at a certain level. And then I make up the gain in stages through my analog gear and my console. And then I capture the audio. So
I heard you talking about this with Warren Hewitt.
Yeah.
All right. So can you give us dumb it down to us and say, hey, more gain means grayer, darker, means less prickly top end, or lower levels? Is there a generality? And when you're saying how you're going to feed, if I'm going to feed a compressor and really blast it hard at the input, not talking about compression, but just feed it hard with a lot of input gain versus sending that same signal 20 dB down, what can we expect to see in the 20 dB down version versus the blown out version?
Well, it's almost impossible to say unless we're talking about specific pieces of gear, because every piece of gear sounds different.
But is there a piece of gear that gets brighter as you feed it harder?
Yeah, brighter and brittle and more distorted.
Okay.
I mean, so generally, without writing all of this down on paper, and it gets really confusing just throwing out numbers. Everything that comes out of my converters comes out at 0 VU essentially. It hits my transfer console, which I knock it down another 2 dB. So relative, it's coming into my console like minus 18 dBFS. Then it hits my EQs. So generally, I've got a dangerous Bax EQ. Well, before that, it hits a set of transformers in general that I run 2-to-1. That's kind of a secret box I have that I use on pretty much everything. So I've got transformers in my console standalone before it even hits any of my gear. Then it hits dangerous Bax EQ, which is just sort of a wide, good filters, but more of like, the Bax EQ gives you that general like 70s Marantz style kind of stereo vibe, real broad strokes. And then I use a valve EQ made by a company. I always mispronounce it. I think it's called Nif, KNIF. The EQ is called a Soma. It's a big parametric vacuum tube EQ. Sounds amazing.
You'll make decisions like, hey, I need to forward feed this guy a little bit more gain to achieve this vibe.
Yeah. And I generally do that. I make those gain adjustments in the box on the way out in general. So I may do an entire album with very few moves on my analog gear once I get it set up. Mm-hmm. So I don't do a ton of compression, honestly. If I do, I do run through compressors. I have multiple compressors, but if I'm going through compressors, it's more for the sound of that unit. And maybe I'm doing a little bit of compression, but I make up kind of gain in stages through the gear. So after I hit EQ, I do a little bit of peak limiting. So I have a custom set of Spectrasonics 610s that Bill from Spectra fine-tuned for me, adjusted the threshold a little bit. I use those. I never use them for compression. I use them specifically for peak limiting. So they're just softly catching some of the peaks. And those are calibrated specifically for my analog chain. So those are set and forget. I never touch them, never make an adjustment on them ever. If I don't want to use them, I take them out. Mm-hmm. Because I already know how they're going to react to most signals going through it. So then I use a lot of the mag stuff. I use the Magnum K comps that I use. They have great parallel EQ. The compressor's great. I rarely use the compressor in it. Like I said, I've got other compression options too, but they have a circuit called the K comp that's just sort of a compressor suppressor that's fixed at around 3K. And again, I have that set in a specific way so that it just keeps, when things get real edgy, when vocals get real edgy right around there, it just sort of softens them just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I've got a Mag EQ4, which is, the kind of the old MTI design. I use that a lot for air boosts. So if something needs a little life, I might do half a dB at 40K. And I know that sounds insane, but you definitely hear it. It's a nice broad sort of boost. I'm a big fan of the Rupert Neve master bus processor. I use that on everything. I've got a Unfair Child with all the bells and whistles in the expansion box, which allows you to use the Fairchild as an actual mastering box, has high and low pass filters and parallel EQ and everything. And I've got some limiters that I'd prefer not talking about because they're kind of custom stuff. Mm-hmm. And then it hits my AD stage, which right now is a Rupert Neve master bus converter. But I use a lot of different converters.
And these things will all patch in and out as needed, all the, depending on what's in the sauce that day.
Sort of. They're all, I can take anything in and out of my mastering console, but for the most part, I know how my chain sounds, and signal will run through it 90% of the time, even if I'm not doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the devices I'm using have either a really pleasing sound or they're really transparent, and I know how they sound. So yeah, I might not be doing anything on the master bus processor except for gain.
Mm-hmm. But it still goes through it.
Yeah.
Let me you tell me your thoughts on my approach to gain staging. It's like, I notice that whenever I put things through a circuit, whether it be at mic level or at line level or instrument level, wherever I'm at, even at the plugin, feeding a plugin channel, meaning the amount of how much gain is on your track. So let's say you put a trim on the top of your plugin, and then you have other plugins and you're adjusting your gain up there. I find in general, to totally dumbify it, and this isn't all catch-all, but I find as soon as, if I have the level too low, things feel anemic. Things feel a little bit, just like, not just because the level was low, because you can raise that level up and compensate to listen to the line level playback of that item. But the more I push into a circuit, depending on what that circuit is and what level it's looking for, mic level, instrument level, or line level, I find that you get sort of a beef in the mid-range, right? It's like it stands forward. It pokes its chest out a little bit, like the API mic pre's are famous for this. If you just turn them all the way down, they're just clean and sort of uninspiring. You push them a little bit and you start to get them up, and usually in that 1 o'clock area, for whatever reason, that's where it is on vocals on those mic pre's. And you start to all of a sudden, it's like, man, this guy feels like he's been playing for an extra hour in the club. Right? It has vibe. Or a drum kit now gets throatier and has a different personality. So when I'm searching for personality, sometimes I will push a circuit to find uniqueness, in the same way that you can't explain the gain staging on a guitar amp, but you just know plugged directly into the console is going to be one feel versus going through just the little bit of gain that isn't distorted. It sort of gives you something that is maybe a little bit high end, comes down a little bit, mid range comes a little more forward. There's those attributes in completely generic terms. I find that when I push a circuit, those things happen, like the center of an SSL or a compressor. And so when I'm looking for stuff that I'm just uninspired, I'll start to experiment with that. But it's always good to go back and in your plugins, bring level back and say, is this plugin harsh and unlistenable because I'm just hitting everything too hard on, should I put a trim at the top? I could still get this 5 dB of gain reduction on this compressor, get all them all to respond the same, but they're seeing a signal that's lower. That'll be a cleaner, less harsh output, in my opinion. Thoughts?
110%. I mean, so getting back to the console, and then let's talk in the box stuff, because I have a couple different workflows for both, but I spent years piecing this console together and putting things in specific places for exactly that purpose. Because as I mentioned, I'm adding gain in stages. So I know the master bus processor sounds better at a certain level. I know the Unfairchild does. I know the mag stuff does, but I know I like to run my EQs at closer to line level or closer to 0. So I'm making up all of that signal as I go along. And I know that my Massilic console, while it's very clean, I like to make up some gain on that as well, because I prefer the way it sounds.
Right.
Now, so a very common way of working for me is I use Wavelab for mastering. So I will set up a session.
PC thing, right?
PC, yes. It works on Mac, but I'm an old IT guy from way before I did all this. So I stick with PCs for mastering.
I used to have Wavelab back in the day.
Yeah. I love it. So I use one, what they call it a track in Wavelab, but I will assemble the raw record, which is my playback track, and then underneath it I have my capture track. I do that all on one system. So on the playback track, I have kind of a generic template that I start with. That's usually I'm a big fan of the Fab Filter stuff, so it's usually a typical setup for me just to start will be a blank EQ and a de-esser that I have a specific preset that I created that does just mid de-essing in the box. And I've dialed it in and gets me kind of in the area where I want to start. On that group of plugins, I apply trim plugins at the beginning of the chain, at the end of the chain. I usually always start by trimming down a specific amount and then making up the gain at the end of the trim plugin, because I find that those plugins that I use operate better that way.
Yeah.
I don't like to get anywhere. I don't clip plugins. I don't like to get anywhere near the red on any of that stuff. It sounds weird and grainy to me.
That's so true. I think so many people are searching for this information too, Pete. It's like, I think everyone talks about gain staging, but it really is important to just start experimenting with it. And, and there's some generalities, but then you'll find that certain things are like great amps. You can't explain them. You just use it when you want this outcome. And that's, in the analog world, that's gain staging for me. Yeah. Right. But in the digital world, I find in general, all plugins sound not great whenever you're just blasting the inputs of them.
It's funny because I've been experimenting with in the box chains, trying my best to recreate this setup in the box. And I've got very close, but I find that when you apply the same sort of gain staging that you do in the analog world, in the digital world, you're going to get a lot closer. I think it's important. I think it's overlooked. And I think that there's a lot of like younger mastering engineers out there that, people get a loan for 50 grand and they buy some speakers and buy a bunch of gear and set up a website and they're mastering records. And just because you have the gear doesn't mean you understand how to use it. And to me, I mean, really, it's like most of this job is gain staging and customer service, understanding your clients, understanding what they want, and understanding your chain. Mm. So, in regards to level, everyone does it differently, but I do all of my digital limiting in the box. The digital plug-in limiters sound way better than any hardware out there, and they just do. And that also gives you more freedom. So I would say most of probably 75-80% of the projects that I work on, I also cut vinyl for. Mm-hmm. So having the ability to have an image, a capture without any digital limiting allows me the flexibility to create vinyl masters from there, make revisions. But I get most of my level in the analog world. If I'm doing 2 dB of limiting on the end, that's a lot for me.
Oh, wow. That's good to hear.
A lot.
I think you brought up a really good point. Back in the day in the analog world, do you remember the Aphex Dominator?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So compressors in the analog world that were fast transient brick wall limiters, they cannot compete with the digital world.
No way.
You do not see anybody collecting. I have an old Optimod that has a Hilbert clipper on it. Is it Hilbert?
Yeah. I don't remember what it's called, but I know that.
But it's beautiful. That, with the exception of that one, you don't find people running around trying to collect fast limiters from the 80s and 70s because they don't work as good as the digital stuff. And even the distressor is the exception of the rule because it's so much more than that, right? Yeah. But the distressor, if you set it fast attack, fast release, there's things in the box that will compete with that really well. So, it's the old, slow photo opto cell, Varimu, what is the Fairchild, the Valve, or Varimu compressor is a tube doing the circuit. Yeah. It's those old, slower circuits that are so pretty to stay in the analog world. And those values sort of kept their weight, but it's like when you're going to do something in the limiting world, I don't think there's any competition to what you're getting in the box, just because the look ahead and the speed of it.
And no one wants to hear the limiting. Everyone wants to hear the Varimu compression because it's big and beautiful and it does this. It's like a warm blanket around the low end, and it makes you feel good, No one wants to hear excessive limiting. No one wants to hear that,
Right. Unless it's on the work tape.
Yeah.
That you're trying to reference. And so we were talking to Reed about this. It's like the effing work tape. It's like we all agree that we hate it and we need to remix it, but then we're going to beat up the mix engineer about why it doesn't have that special attribute that the 20 dB louder work tape has.
Well, it screws us too at the mastering stage. When you get there are a lot of mixing engineers that just for reference, they just automatically will throw whatever limiter on at their setting, and they don't even really listen to it. And it's like, this is 4 dB louder than I would want to master it. You know?
And then how do you let somebody listen to your master when it's 4 dB lower? It's just not. It's not going to win.
Yeah, I have a question for you. This is something that a lot of my mixer friends want. How much headroom do you prefer to get on a mix?
I don't fucking care. Like, here's my rule: make the mix sound good. Like, this has been a pet peeve of mine for years, and I've heard mastering engineers in the past complain, like, say outlandish things like, take all your mix bus processing off before you send it to the mastering engineer. It's like, that's insanity.
It's insane.
Like, I would never tell a mixer that I can do a better job mixing their record than they could. And or that I have a better compressor than you, so I'm going to do a better job at figuring out the vibe of your mix. That's ridiculous. I mean, I have, I get stuff from Michael Brower. That shit is smoking hot, and his mixes are perfect. Honestly, 95% of his mixes, you just listen to and send them back because they're perfect. And that's okay, because he knows what he's doing. Level wise, I would just say the rule, if you're using a limiter as a mixing engineer, the only thing I would keep in mind is that if you're doing a very large amount of limiting, you could potentially be tying the mastering engineer's hands a bit. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. If you don't want your mixes touched very much, and you're really happy with the sound, then by all means bake that in. But there are certain times where we might run into a technical issue, like if someone's using a brick wall limiter and it's going all the way up to 0 and we want to do anything to it, then oftentimes that's a problem, because as soon as you throw a plug-in on it, you're getting intersample peaks, or your plug-in chain is overloading. And, I mean, most of the time, if I get a really loud screaming master or screaming mix, that thing's not hitting my analog chain, because it's going to fall apart going through the chain because it's already insanely loud. It just doesn't make any sense to have that leave the digital domain. So these are all things that, I think engineers should just keep in mind. But having said that, I think whatever works for you, you should do. And you'll develop a relationship with a mastering engineer, and everyone will understand what the expectations are.
And I guess in a perfect world, it'd be best if you got something without a brick wall limiter on it. Like, they bake in all their compressors, and even if there's limiting, like the peak limiters on a 32-264 that aren't 100-1, a little bit of limiting that's part of the sound. But like, to get a sausaged out file is you're kind of wasting your money with a guy like you, because there's a lot of things you can't get into.
Yeah, but then there's the inverse of that, and I've had this. This hasn't happened in a while, but I've had it happen before, where mix engineers mix into a very aggressive 2-bus, like brick wall limiting, multi-band compression, stereo widening, all of that jazz. Everything's been approved based on that. Then they go to export their files and they bypass all that stuff, and they send these crazy sounding files, and they expect me to recreate everything they did, which is ridiculous. I mean, why would you do that? It just doesn't make any sense.
Completely different record. Completely different. So
everything that makes the vibe, that has to be part of the sound.
Mm-hmm. And conversely, when I'm mixing a record, I tell people, hey man, if you've got a flanger or a biphase on something, print it. You can give me the original version, but print it, because if you've signed off, that's a thing that has an envelope on it, and you've already signed off on everything about that sort of dug into effect that's printed. Print it on a vocal. throw it on a reverb, throw them on there. If you love the reverb, just record the reverb to the side and I can decide. But like, if somebody puts a great flanger on a guitar, there's no sense in me re-engineering the wheel. They had all the emotion and inspiration for that effect. So I tell them to print that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we're not, you know, I always think about, when I'm thinking of analogies for mastering, I'm kind of a motorcycle car guy, so everything's a motorcycle or car analogy. But if you were, you know, we're essentially the car detailers. Like after the car gets built, we're the ones that make it look really good and get it on the showroom floor and make sure that it's suitable for consumer consumption. Like, it's not my job to put a new engine, to rebuild the engine and put a new steering wheel in it. Now, if it needs to, I will gladly do it. But the trade-off is there's obviously more of a compromise when we're dealing with a stereo track as opposed to the multi-tracks. So anytime you can get something right at the multi-track level, you should be, because oftentimes I might have to compromise something because I'm only dealing with 2 tracks. And granted, there's a lot I can do now with mid-side and all sorts of multi-band compression if we need to get into it, but it's never going to sound as good as getting the mix right. Yeah. So like, no amount of mastering is a substitute for a good mix.
And plus, here's where the real value is. It's like, artist finds producer, producer finds band, band makes record with producer and artist. Everybody does their art, and everybody stays in their lane and hires people that they respect.
Yeah. So
now I get to have an opinion about artists' art in general performance stuff from great world-class musicians, rather than giving them so much math that they stop being artists. Then I get to be a mix engineer and make this record, the final version of it, the mix of it, that I take some liberties and I go and maybe put a flanger on something, or I do this other thing. Then I get to give that to you, and you get to take that and do your art with it. All along the way, people have made decisions that they're committed to, and other people have been influenced by those decisions. It's a game of telephone. And by the end of it, if you wait to print your tubas at your place, there's no way you're going to get any kind of interpretation. Art is an aggregate. It's a collaboration of people operating above their means. Yeah. That's when you get the great stuff. And you're just taken away from that process and diminishing an extraordinary outcome.
Now, there are times, though, that the client will specifically say, hey, I have some stuff I want to try in mastering. I mean, I did a record for Sturgill Simpson called Sound and Fury. And, you know, there's probably some little details I can get into, but it's a very extreme sounding record. And there was stuff he specifically wanted to do in mastering, and one of them was laying it back super hot to 1/2 inch at 15 IPS. And we did it. So we added a lot of vibe. The mixes already had a lot of vibe, but we definitely added a lot of flavor in the mastering stage on that one. And he had a specific vision. And so that was that's really fun when you get to do that stuff.
That's still an interpretation, though. An artist getting together with you guys imagining what's possible. And it's like, hey, we can always erase this. Let's do it and see what we think. That is, people have to make decisions. Jim Scott yesterday was talking about Wildflowers for Tom Petty. And he was saying, Mike, correct me here if I'm wrong. He was saying that the drums on that are 6 tracks, right? 6 tracks of drums.
It was a 24-track recording total.
But 6 tracks. And he was like, if they needed a vocal overdub, they were erasing the room mics. It's like, sorry, room mics. It's so arbitrary. We were talking about how arbitrary, like in my mind, that was an uncompromised, perfect recording. And to know that someone has said, hey, by the way, we're going to get rid of those room mics now because we need to put this extra tambourine overdub that we're going to eventually not use in the mix. Yeah. I'd be losing my mind. But, you know, it comes out so perfectly. But the reality is, it's like, making decisions is our job. Having opinions and making decisions are our job. And we get paid very well. Like you said, people can buy the gear in your room. You can go out with 50 grand and build a mastering suite gear-wise. But who knows if it's the right gear? You got to have the right gear. Sounds like you look for the right gear for you, right? It might not be something that another guy has, but that's what it's about. It's the person, is my point.
Yeah, I've spent years, you know, meticulously auditioning gear and shooting out, I mean, I spent years doing crazy converter shootouts, and I've got stacks of converters here, and oftentimes I will use different DACs to feed the chain based on what they sound like, and different ADs to capture. It all depends, but yeah, it's just honestly years of trial and error and getting it to the place.
And it doesn't matter the gear. I think my point is, it's the operator. It's your Dale Earnhardt Prius analogy.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, I mean, the humanity is still in music, which I'm truly grateful for.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the gear, and that's one thing, like I've always insisted on my website, you're not going to go to my website and see a list of my gear. And the reason you don't is because it doesn't matter. If someone is coming to, if they want to work with me because I have an unfair child, and that's the reason they want to work with me, frankly, I probably don't want to work with them.
Right.
Like, I don't think it matters. It's just another tool. And let's face it, like I said, if I could figure out a way to be 100% in the box, and I can do that in a couple of years from now, I might be. If I can get the same result on my analog gear, the problem is that it's not there yet for me.
Yeah.
And the other interesting part is there are times I probably do 20% of my work in the box, and that all depends on usually the level of the track. Like I said, if I get really hot stuff in, it might stay in the box. It takes me longer to do a record in the box than it does through my analog chain. I just like the analog. I like the tactical workflow. I'm faster this way. And and it's just like muscle memory, and it's like conducting for me. And when I'm mousing around, it just it takes me forever,
And there's things that when you hit a set of transformers, it's just it does something that you don't have to reach for an EQ later to deal with. Yeah. So there's things you can count on being just generated by running through a piece of gear.
100%.
Yeah, and you just never get it. I hate to say you never get it. It doesn't even matter, because at the end of the day, give a guy enough tools and he'll build an airplane, right? It might not be the highest quality tools, but it's really about your vision of the airplane you're building, the art that you're making. Yeah. So if I gave you a Mackie 8 bus and asked you to master a record, you, at the end of the day, you deliver something that worked musically. Yeah. So, I mean, but there are things about this, like my old V72s, nothing sounded like those. Yeah. Nothing. I got a BA43 line amp, an RCA BA43, a 46, and a 45, a photo opto cell, and a FET limiter that was an old broadcast situation. I put something through that me and Mike was writing, and Mike was like in the kitchen in my barn, a reverberant space. And he's like, "What'd you do to the bass?" Like the instant I brought it up, he's like, "Whoa. What just happened to the bass?" And he walked over, and I'm like, "Oh, I put it through this." And it's just like, that's part of it too. It's just that if you didn't have that, you'd find another way to do it. And that is what's truly special about mastering engineers and finding people, finding mix engineers, finding mastering engineers, finding musicians that you like to create with, that are just, they're desert island guys. They're going to be able to get it done.
Yeah. You put the right team together, and, I mean, most of my clients are all repeat clients. Like, we just have these little teams, and it's the production team, and you do enough records with someone, everything is just unspoken at that point. Everyone knows what to do, and it's just a well-oiled machine.
Well, it sounds like you got a beautiful perspective of how to create music. That's what I look for whenever I'm making records. Where can people find you if they're interested in having you work on their record?
Yeah, infrasonicmastering.com. I think we're on Facebook. I stay off that mess most of the time. We're on Instagram, and I'm on Instagram, which is kind of my personal mastering and motorcycles mostly stuff. And my handle is Plyman, Plyman. We're around working, putting our heads down and working.
We'll put all that down in the description so folks can find you. It's both a YouTube, just so people listening know, we have a YouTube channel where you can actually watch us, three beautiful faces on the screen talking. Essentially the same exact version of what you're hearing on the audio only portion of this podcast. But check us out if you're listening to us on one of the streaming platforms. Go ahead and check out our YouTube channel. We have a lot of content on there that's not on here, like studio tours and whatnot, that just are so much more visual. And if you're on our YouTube channel, check out our streaming stuff. Go to, iTunes or Spotify and whatnot, wherever the podcasts are. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Pete, for hanging out with us and being such a cool, down-to-earth dude. It seems like you're easy to make a record with, and that's key.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you,
All right, pal. That's it for this week. We'll see you next time on the West Barn.